my first day with the emergency services team, I was asked to head down to the Department of Premier and Cabinet down near Martin Place to help our volunteers. We had a team of volunteers down there along with a number of other organisations sort through the many thousands of tributes and notes and tokens that had been left in Martin Place following the siege in December. So we were sorting them so that they could be archived and then passed on to the families of the people who'd lost their lives, as well as the survivors and the emergency services. So it was a pretty interesting first day on the job and a pretty interesting way to start with the emergency services space. So I got to learn a lot more than I ever could have on a first day sitting behind a desk and reading procedural documents. The first thing I learned was how amazing our volunteers are. They were so professional and so calm, and they were able to provide me comfort when I was nervous on my first day. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that the focus of our work and the reaction of the community and the way that an emergency impacts our volunteers and our staff is different every time. Every emergency is different. But the one thing that stays the same is that our volunteer workforce, which is our workforce, are always trained in psychological first aid. So they're always there to provide care and comfort. And psychological first aid, the idea behind it is that you can provide care and comfort to someone without providing any further trauma. So we really encourage people to sit back and not dive in with questions, and to be comfortable with silence and not feel like you need to ask those probing questions. So reading the cards and categorising them from an event like Martin Place Siege wasn't a normal job for our volunteers by any stretch. And so that was the second thing that I learned, that flexibility is a really important part of working in this space. And to give you an idea, there were boxes and boxes and boxes of these tributes that had been, first of all, left at the memorial, the spontaneous memorial down at Mountain Place, and then removed one by one from the flowers so that they could be categorised and archived and maintained in that way, and then passed on to the families of the loved ones of people who had lost their lives or who had been through that. And so some of the notes, most of the notes, were just people expressing their grief and shock that this had happened in their city. And a lot of the notes were directed at the survivors or the emergency services, thanking them for their work. And then, of course, there were notes that individuals had written who had known the people that did lose their lives. And so one of the notes that I read was someone who went to school with one of the people that lost their lives. And I can still remember a lot of the words that she wrote about going to school with him and her relationship with him and what he had meant to her. So I also learned on that day that we can't always leave this kind of work at the office at 5 o'clock. So I started off at Red Cross 2 years before that. I actually started off volunteering in the marketing team. And I was lucky enough that after a few weeks volunteering full-time that I was offered a short-term contract to continue some of that work. So I did that for a little while, and then lucky enough there was a job going in the events team which I applied for, and I received. And I was extremely fortunate in my timing, because that was the year that Red Cross was hosting the statutory meetings of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, which is essentially where every Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Crystal in the world comes to one place. So Sydney was hosting the Red Cross Olympics essentially, and I got to be part of the team that organised it. So it was an extremely cool event to work on. But more than that, it was amazing to get to know the organisation so well in such a short time. Red Cross is a ginormous beast, and I actually got to know it quite well and really got to understand the role that this organisation plays, not just in Australia, but around the world. So it was a pretty phenomenal thing to get to work on. And the year following that, I actually worked to help commemorate the centenary of Australian Red Cross. So it was 100 years old in 2014, having been started just a couple of days after the outbreak of World War I. So I got to hear and experience more local and intimate Red Cross stories than I ever would have thought. Like one of the politicians that I met through the course of the centenary celebrations revealed to me that his wife needed a blood transfusion while she was giving birth to their second child. And one of the staff members that I met as I worked with them around the centenary celebrations told me that she had been drawn to working with Red Cross because of the work that Red Cross had done for them during Cyclone Tracy, which was pretty cool. So you're always hearing lots of Red Cross stories, which I always really like. But in those first 2 years at Red Cross, I had seen the emergency services team respond to a number of events, one of which was the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires, which you've heard a little bit about already. So I took up a secondment with the emergency services team and I've become very comfortable with the short-term contract, which is something I'd advise people to do if they're interested in working in this space. And within a couple of months found myself in Dungog in the Hunter Valley here in New South Wales. And for those of you that don't remember, there was a pretty monstrous East Coast low that hit New South Wales in April of 2015. And that event, I don't know if you remember, the Premier was on TV telling us all to stay home because public transport was a nightmare. And it was the storm had a pretty huge impact. There were hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses that lost power for a number of weeks. And one of the towns that was worst impacted was Dungog up in the Hunter Valley. And you might remember seeing news footage of houses being washed away and hearing the news of people losing their lives in their homes up in Dungog. So this was the first time I was sent out to a town that had been really severely impacted. And with a town with such a small population, you could really feel the impacts. And so it was my first time putting my psychological first aid training to the test, so I was really nervous. But the first day that I was working in the recovery centre, which was about a week after the event, a man came in and was just asking where the local food bank was. As is often the case following an emergency, the community really rallied together, and one of the things they did was coordinate a food bank. And he was asking where it was, and without me even really needing to ask him how he was going or ask that many questions of him, he revealed to me that he had been isolated in his house for 5 days because of the floodwaters. And he obviously didn't have power, so he had no way of communicating with the outside world. He didn't have power, so all the food he had to eat was the food that was slowly going off in his fridge, and he'd gotten really sick because of it. And so this man just broke down in front of me, and I kind of couldn't believe that it didn't really take me asking any questions for him to reveal just how impacted he'd been by the event. And what I really reflected on then was that a lot happens in a town, and if any of you have been to a town following an emergency, there's a huge amount of attention and a rush of energy, and there are lights and sirens and lots of people wearing high-vis gear walking around a town, and they're all doing really important work, whether it be restoring the power or putting tarps up to keep people safe and dry in their own homes. But there aren't many people there to talk to the people, and that's the role that Red Cross fills, and I think that's just such a critical role. And I really reflected on that first day in the recovery centre when I realised I think I'm the first person that this man has spoken to properly since the event, and just what an important role that is. And we're greeted with a lot of trust, and I think it's just such a privilege to have that trust, and we have to be so mindful of that when we go into a community, because that's a trust that's built up over hundreds of years of this organisation, and based on the fact that we are neutral and impartial and we have access to places that other organisations don't. So that's always something that I reflect on when I go into communities in that way. I have to say though that our role in responding to emergencies isn't our only important one, and I would say for me it's not even necessarily where we have our greatest impact. I think what really excites me in my role is when we're in a community 2 years before a disaster or 3 years afterwards, because I think that's sometimes where you can really see the longevity of this kind of work and really feel its impact. And so one of the most interesting things that I've gotten to work on since being in the emergency services space was a preparedness project called Beyond the Emergency Assembly Point. It actually a gap was identified because of the Blue Mountains bushfires. So there were a number of children's services in the Blue Mountains that had pretty scary close calls. So things like there being fire coming up a valley where children were still in the children's service and staff having conversations about how they might go about evacuating when it was really too late to do so. And so having heard and had that conversation with a number of children's services, we decided to run a series of workshops to try and build the capacity of children's services to prepare for, respond to, and then recover from those kinds of emergencies. And so the interesting thing was that children's services, like many businesses or organisations, they have to have an emergency management plan. They're legally required to here and regularly practice how to get to an assembly point. But as I'm sure you've all been through very civil, calm drills where you all orderly pick up your bags in just enough time and prepare going out to the assembly point. You stand out there for 5 minutes, check your phone, and you're back at your desk within 15 minutes. And so that was obviously the case with a lot of children's services, which is why we decided to run these series of workshops. So what we'd do is we'd get all the different emergency service agencies in, and they'd be able to talk about their roles and what it is they actually do in an emergency, but also importantly their limitations, because as Rachel said, there's not enough of them to cover every house. There's not enough trucks to pick up children from every children's service. And so I think one of the great things about that project is Red Cross kind of neatly treads the line between two worlds. So we can understand the emergency services world because we do respond to emergencies and we do have a role to play in that space. But we also tread the world of service provision because there are other parts of Red Cross that provide daily phone calls to elderly or isolated people. So we actually understand that the need for that kind of business continuity and the need that some people are dependent on our service and that can't change even if there is an emergency. So through those workshops, we were able to provide a space where people, directors from services, could share ideas and share concerns and share confusion around some of the requirements that they have. And so there were some amazing stories that came out of it and amazing suggestions that I know other services then adopted. So one example of that was a children's service where the director did get sick of those very orderly drills, and they would always do it when the children were all gathered together and it was all nice and easy. So she decided that from here on in what she was going to do was not be the one to instigate an emergency evacuation drill, but instead hide an emergency card. So a staff member might be pouring themselves a cup of tea and then find this card, and even though that it's nap time, have to practice evacuating everyone and moving children while they were having a sleep. Or there might be a card hidden in the nappy drawer and it's parental pickup time, but they all have to get involved and participate in the drill, which obviously was really enthusiastically greeted by the parents. But it's such a great idea in terms of engaging people in the emergency planning process. Another one of the favourite stories that I heard through the course of that project was a service that told of the time where they evacuated and everything went beautifully. So it was a neighbouring building that had caught fire, so they were evacuating as a precaution and their premises was actually totally fine. But so they made their way to the assembly point and everything was nice and calm and everyone was happy. And then they got the list of all the parents of the kids that were there that particular day, and they started doing the ring around. But of course, all the parents could hear down the end of the phone was sirens, which when it's your daycare centre calling isn't exactly the sound that anyone wants to hear. So they now send a group text and advise other people to do the same. So those were the kinds of stories that we got to share and relate in that kind of an environment. So I guess I'll just finish up today by saying it's a really exciting time in the emergency services space, and like this event, this kind of consultation process is happening in a number of different places. So thank you for your contributions to where we're going to next and what we're going to do next, because we're going to need your help. But one of the first things that we can all do is, like Rachel said, is get prepared ourselves. And so I would ask, if you're going to do one thing after today in terms of emergency preparedness, I would suggest that you have a conversation with your loved ones about what you're going to do, where you might go during an emergency. Because having spoken to people that have been through an emergency, the thing that causes the most stress and anxiety and the thing that sticks with people for many, many years after an event is often that they didn't know where their loved ones were. And so even just having a conversation can be a really important first step in getting prepared for emergencies and meaning that you can be a lot more calm in that kind of a situation. So thank you.
Thank you.